Hello, 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 my friends. Thanks for being here with WriteHive 2024. I am thrilled to be doing the Guest of Honor interview with Zamil Akhtar. Thanks for being here, Zamil.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, my pleasure. So, I'm Nicholas W. Fuller. I'm on YouTube. I'm writing things that you haven't seen yet because they're not out yet. But the person that you're here to see is Zamil. So, Zamil, can you do a little bit of an introduction for us, please?
Sure. So I've been a self-pub author since October 2020 when I published my debut novel, Gunmetal Gods. And Gunmetal Gods is a dark fantasy uh, inspired by the Crusades. It's got a lot of influence from H.P. Lovecraft, from Game of Thrones, and it's sort of it launched, I think, rather quietly, but over time the fan base grew, and eventually I started writing more books in the series, and now there's three books, and it's sort of become a pretty well known series in the self pub arena. And I have another series called Light Blade, which is a progression fantasy series. So it's very, very different from Gunmetal Gods. But that's another one that is currently ongoing. Right now, I'm writing the fourth book in the Gunmetal Gods series. And I hope I'll be able to write the fifth and final book by next year as well. So yeah, I'm just in the midst of things. I'm writing. I'm super excited and happy to be here with you, Nicholas, for this Right Hive Guest of Honor conference.
Well, thank you. Excited to be talking with you too. I feel like you're leaving a few things off here, Zamo, because you're a little humble, saying you quietly launched, but it's growing. And like you are a Spiffbo semifinalist, which is kind of a big deal. Self-published fantasy blog off or book off, whatever one. But yeah, big deal. Well done, kudos. And you fairly recently ran a Kickstarter for a special edition of Gunmetal Gods that had 1,200 plus backers and raised over $115,000, which is not that quiet anymore, my friend. Not that quiet, you know?
Yeah, honestly, you know, it's hard to absorb, like especially the Kickstarter. It's hard to absorb it and to like uh, reframe my understanding of myself. But I'm still just a guy who every day I wake up, I sit at the keyboard, I write, I send out a tweet every now and then. So I guess that's the life of every self-pub author, more or less.
Yeah, 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 right. I mean, yeah, yeah. We sort of work in our own little bubble, and then suddenly, like, people start paying attention. It's like, wait, no, I'm still just here in my bubble, right?
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. That's exactly what it feels like.
Well, I mean, even before this, I've heard your name floating around, so it's fun to get to talk with you. You've been someone that I've been thinking about for a while. So I want to talk to you about a few different things. I want to start with talking about you, just a little bit about you as a person, because I think you have some interesting background. Then get into kind of talking about the self-pub business a little bit, and then get into craft. So let's start with you as a person.
I
I
love
love that bio that you had on your website and kind of speaks to you kind of as a person. So when Zamel was 14, you moved from the dry dune-spotted Arabian Peninsula to the hilly Arctic wasteland that is Western Massachusetts. You despise the cold, you're not very fond of the sun, you prefer spending all day indoors mashing the keyboard in hope that something great will come of it. I think you're hitting on that last part these days, you're getting some greatness. But I'd love to hear like what made you as a 14-year-old, clearly it must have been your parents' decision because you were a minor, but still, like what was the impetus from moving from the dry dune-spotted Arabian Peninsula to the Arctic wasteland of Western Massachusetts? How did that happen?
Yeah, it was a big, big change, obviously, and it's bigger than I can even let on in a short little description.
Yeah.
But it started as a very technical thing. So the school system there ended actually at ninth grade,
Oh,
right?
wow.
So we actually had to move over here, or rather over to Massachusetts, so that I could continue, going to school.
Hmm.
And you know, going from a place like that, I was living in the capital city in Saudi Arabia, so it was a big city. Obviously the culture is very different, and then going to suburban Massachusetts, I mean, it was like totally I mean, not just a shock, but it was like just like, you know, everything changed basically.
Yeah. It's hard to imagine. I moved from Southern California to Central Florida, which is obviously like two different parts of the, US, and that felt significantly different. I can only imagine like, the differences that you had. Um, One thing you mentioned, you moved to like suburbia. I've heard before from other folks that are not American, Europeans and such that the uh, concept of American suburbia is sort of like depicted in Hollywood and that sort of thing, and they think that it's fiction, and then like, but they like the understanding that that's actually real, and that's how so much of America lives in this like suburban craziness is reality. Was that sort of true for you that you had no concept that that was
Well,
what life was like
it's
in parts of the US?
it's funny you say that. It's funny you say that because I used to watch these TV shows, and I also used to read Archie comics. Okay, now I don't know if you're familiar, but I might be a little bit older than you, but back in the day, like, Archie
Hmm.
comics, like my parents used to read them, and then they had Archie comics, and then I used to read them, and then I used to buy them like at the store. And it depicted this image of suburban life where
Hmm.
everyone was kind of close knit,
Hmm.
everyone knew each other. You could rollerblade to the mall. You could
Okay.
walk to, like, I don't know, you could walk to the diner, and sitting in Saudi Arabia and reading this stuff, and also just watching, like, TV shows that depict suburban life. I was actually excited. I thought, like, wow, this, like, my social life is gonna get a lot, like, even better. My It's gonna be super cool. I'm gonna be able to rollerblade to the mall. But when I got there, what I learned was that you're like I was living in this house, and there was, like, you know to get to the mall, I would have to have my parents drive me like 10
Yeah.
minutes to go to
Yeah.
school. I needed to be driven there, or I had to take the bus, like,
All
to see
right.
my friends who were, like, in the other part of town. Again, I had to have my parents drive me. So, I ended up being stuck at home a lot more than I was when I lived in, the big city of Riyadh, Saudi Arabia.
Right.
And it kind of bummed me out. Like, I felt
Yeah.
like, no, this is not what I was
This is
promised. This is
not what I
not,
was promised. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. That's so funny. Yeah, I hate that about American suburbia, that like a car is a requirement. Dumpster. Wish we'd get better about that, but Um, so that's interesting though, that hearing like you were clearly like exposed to some Western media while you were young. So I wanted to talk about that because I think that what's interesting about Gunmetal Gods, many things are interesting about Gunmetal Gods, but like the way that you kind of incorporate sort of that Middle Eastern mythology and setting sort of with a sort of a Game of Thrones style story that's a kind of a comparable that you've made before. um I'd love to kind of hear more about how you brought those together a little bit as we're kind of talking about your background. Was it like, did it just feel really natural, or was it very intentional?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it was, I think, the, like, most satisfying part of writing Gunmetal Gods, because to take another culture that is not based on the English language, for example,
Hmm.
and to sort
Hmm.
of put it into words in English is pretty difficult to do. Because, like, okay, if I say the word bazaar to you, as in the market, a bazaar,
Oh,
right?
okay. Yeah, yeah,
Probably in your head you might imagine something from, like, Aladdin, or something you saw on the internet, like, of this sort of uh medieval looking Middle Eastern style place where there are shops, right? So when you try to put this kind of world into English, you have to be really careful about, like, your word choices, right? Because everyone
yeah.
has these associations, and you don't have the flexibility that you have if you were writing, like, in a purely European setting. Um, but it was something I had to sit down, and I had to intentionally think about this in a very deep way. And I had to think about, okay, my readers are mostly Westerners, Americans, Europeans, British folks, Australians, Canadians, and their exposure to the Middle East is pretty limited. It's what they've seen on the news. It's
Right.
things like Aladdin, Arabian Nights. So I had
Sure.
to consciously think, okay, when I use a word, when I describe something, what are they thinking of? It's not what am I thinking of? I've lived in those countries, I've been all over the place. I know what the reality is. It's what are they thinking of, and how can I convey the truth based on what they're thinking of?
Yeah.
And so it was a very deliberate, very conscious sort of approach that I had to take. And the most satisfying thing that readers tell me, that a reader can tell me, is to tell me that I've transported them into what they feel is an authentic Middle Eastern style fantasy world. And when readers tell me that, it feels like all my effort, all the thought I put into that process paid off.
That's fantastic. That's really interesting too. And we're kind of getting into craft, so we're jumping ahead, which is
Yeah.
fantastic. But like, um, I love that you're thinking about the reader so much and the audience so much, and like, I mean, clearly you have a wonderful mastery of the English language, but I imagine that you have a similar mastery of Arabic. What made you choose to write in English? Was it a market-based decision because the US and like Western-based market is really big, or was it just you wanted to bring sort of that Middle Eastern culture to the Western audience?
Yeah, so my first language is actually English.
Okay.
Mainly because you know, ev- ever since since kindergarten, I went to an American school. So, it was an American international school in Riyadh,
Mm-hmm.
Saudi Arabia. And so I learned everything, in terms of schooling in English. And English is my is my best language, basically, is the best way I can express myself. And
Sure.
as you say, it also has the biggest market. I
Mm.
mean, in Arabic, there is no fantasy genre or fantasy market that even exists. And even if I wanted to write in Arabic, I don't think I could. I couldn't, do it at the level that I can in English.
Sure.
So in terms of choosing English, it was sort of a no-brainer.
Yeah.
And basically all the media that I'm referencing, or that
Mm-hmm.
I'm sort of using as a building block for Gunmetal Gods, all of it is media that I engaged with in English. Like I mentioned, Game of Thrones, Lovecraft, even the Arabian Nights. I read it in English. I didn't read
Mm-hmm.
it in Arabic. Um, that said, it's um, it's still, I feel like, even though it's written in English, it's still an expression that obviously is coming from someone who has lived in the Middle East,
Right.
who grew up there and who lived that life.
Right. Right. Oh, I am already sure that I couldn't have written your book. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, it had to come from you. Um, that's awesome. So let's kind of get back to business a little bit. Um, let's get to kind of the beginning. You put this out a few years ago and you've decided to self-publish. So why did you decide to self-publish?
Yeah, that's a great question. It wasn't even my intention at the very beginning. Uh, I when I started out, I had more or less decided to traditionally publish.
Hmm.
And I wrote the book thinking that, okay, I have to conform to what traditional publishers are going to want from a book.
Mm,
But it was around the time when I'd finished writing the first draft that I realized that the traditional publishing process is very tedious. Like for weeks or months or even years, I would have to sit there sending query letters out to agents, waiting for them to respond. And even if they did respond, you know, and they asked for the manuscript, I'd have to wait for them to read it. I'd have to wait for them to give me an offer. And then
mm,
once they made the offer, I'd have to wait for them to sell the book to a publisher. And this can take many, many years.
right.
Meanwhile, and that was when I started learning about this other model called self-publishing.
Hmm.
And it was actually Brandon Sanderson in one of his lectures that he does online, that where he sort of detailed how this model works. And I was like, this is a no-brainer. This sounds way better.
Yeah.
Um, and so from that point onward, I was like, no, forget about traditional publishing. Just forget about it completely. We're going to self-publish this. And, you know, the best part of that was the moment I hit publish on Amazon, uh, and Gunmetal Gods was out there, I didn't have to wait for anyone else to like, affirm what I'd done. I could just immediately start writing book two, which is what I did.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think so this is something which like I'm so happy. I'm so happy that I went down that path. And as it's just as I mentioned, it's just gotten, better and better over time. Like the
Right.
fruit that I've gained from going down this path.
Absolutely, yeah. Which is a perfect segue into the next thing I want to talk about. Like you've kind of you've continued to grow. I'd love to hear more about what you think has helped your book reach a wider audience and continue to grow and kind of continue to be sort of in this indie fantasy zeitgeist, the discussion. I mean, clearly one of the things that sort of helps is that your book stands apart from the crowd because of this sort of unique setting that you have. But what sort of marketing things have you done in addition to being, as I mentioned at the top, you're semi-finalist in the self-published fantasy blog off or book off. I've heard it both ways lately, but anyway. So what's sort of helped you out?
Yeah, it's very challenging. It's a very challenging, I think, market to stand out and to sort of, you know, I think because there's so many self-published books, published all the time, and there's so many new stories that can catch people's attention, so it's super difficult. And I think part of like I can't say for sure what did it. Like I can't say absolutely for sure that I know what did it for me. But
Sure.
I think it was just from my perspective, whenever I saw there was an opportunity I could step into, I stepped forward and I did. And I took that opportunity. Like Spiffbo, for example, obviously entering Spiffbo, you have to, I had to wake up, I think I forget, like at 2 a.m. and submit it, but I saw, okay, there's a little window here that's open where I can gain some attention. Let
Hmm.
me go and let me put Gunmetal Gods in that little window.
Yep.
Now, even before Spiffbo, there were some other things, like there was Reddit.
Hmm.
I went on there and I asked the mods, like, okay, can I post about my book? And they said, okay, yeah, why not? You can post about your book. So, I posted about my book, and I had a post about it that blew up. It was a cover reveal for the second book. It got like, I don't know, 2,000 or something upvotes,
Upvotes.
and
Yeah.
just from that attention, I think 200 people downloaded my book. So,
That's what's up.
it's like, for me, it was just an approach. It was just looking and seeing,
Where are the readers? Where are
where
the
like,
opportunities?
yeah, where's the place where I can like get my book seen? Um, and, another big one I have to mention was the Daniel Green review. So Daniel Green reviewed the book, and that's something which very few he reviews very few books from indie authors, and it all came from this whole thing came from a video that he did where he roasted my bookshelf. Okay, he does these bookshelf
Yeah, yeah.
roasts every few months, right? And
Hmm.
he saw my book on the bookshelf and he was like, okay, that book looks interesting, it has a cool title. So I messaged him and I was like, hey, you thought it was interesting, why don't you read it? I'll send it to you. And he said, okay. So again, it was just like this small little window that opened,
Yeah.
like that I just stepped into.
Right.
So that's the only thing, like which windows open change over time, okay? Like now I've
Yes,
heard
yes,
that, for
yes.
example, on Reddit, they've gotten super strict about their policy for self promo, right? So
Right.
some windows will close and others will open, and you kind of just have to like be aware and see, okay, is this window open? Can I stick it in there? And just do it.
Just do it. Yep. Yep. Yeah. And by the way, anyone in the audience, if you're not familiar with Daniel B. Green, he's on YouTube. He's a, booktuber, but he's got these days like 500,000 subscribers. So like, yeah, if and he called your book S tier.
Yeah.
So yeah, if someone is saying if Daniel B. Green is saying your book is good, that's gonna have some reach, That's a good thing. Um, that's really cool. Yeah, and I love that, yeah, the idea of like just kind of go for it. Just because what do you have to lose, right? I'm sure that's
Exactly.
been your attitude the whole time, right?
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so one more question kind of on business related, probably, although it could be craft depending on your answer. But what's something that you wish you knew before you kind of becoming an author and putting like pressing that publish button for the first time, you know?
Yeah, I think it's always you're always advantaged if you prepare more. So
Mm,
I was not, as much as I say I was taking all my shots, I was taking all the opportunities.
sure.
I don't think I was prepared for success. I think I was more expecting failure. And I was maybe that's just because I'm a little bit, negatively minded in terms of what I think the outcome of my efforts will be. So so there are a lot of things I wish um I had, I had planned for, or I had I wish I had like planned more to capitalize on the successes that I got. And it could be just something like, okay, when I was writing like the second book,
Hmm.
I maybe I could have written it faster, and I could have written it realizing that the series is going to be a success. So why don't I get more books out in a faster period, right? And then like after I wrote the second book, I started writing Lightblade. And I started writing it sort of because I didn't think Gunmetal Gods was going to continue to grow and grow. Again, it was sort
Mm,
of like I had this negative outlook. And so I switched to writing a new series. Whereas, I probably should have just continued writing more Gunmetal Gods books because it kept growing, it kept rolling forward
hmm.
and getting bigger and bigger. So I guess that's sort of like I wish I had more of a um more of a positive outlook on things. Um, and I wish I'd expected myself to succeed. Maybe then I would have set myself up a little bit better.
That is so interesting. That is, yeah. That is,
It's weird,
just
right?
no, no, because like I'm working on getting out there, and that's not something that I can. It's something that only you can kind of have that experience and be like, man, I wait, but that's really
Yeah.
cool. But getting into the next question that you've really kind of given me a great segue into this other topic that I wanted to ask about. You've started this other series, this Light Blade series, and I'm curious, like it is a little bit of a departure and it's a progression fantasy. And progression fantasy right now is pretty hot on Amazon, especially Kindle Unlimited. Was it kind of a market-based decision where you thought, I want to go capture this, or was it sort of like I want to write something new and I really enjoy progression fantasy, or was it a marriage of the two? What sort of led you down the idea of starting this new series?
Yeah, I don't think Lightblade is even a typical progression fantasy. Like I read some of the progression fantasies that were popular.
Hmm.
And I sort of decided that, okay, I'm gonna write a progression fantasy, but it's not gonna follow the tropes of the popular series that are out there.
Hmm.
So Lightblade is still very much like its own thing, and it's still very much like a projection of like some of my ideas that wouldn't have necessarily fit into Gunmetal Gods. So like it's more of a cyberpunk world than a medieval dark fantasy world.
Hmm.
It plays with very different themes, like it plays with themes regarding the nature of reality. It plays with the theme of lucid dreaming. It plays with all these like different, very different themes than Gunmetal Gods, but still topics that like I'm interested in, and topics which I felt I could reach readers with. Um, and the progression fantasy aspect I think was like, yeah, it was a desire to connect with this big reader base that was very hot on Amazon, and people are having a lot of success with. That was definitely there was that business decision that I made, that I want to capture this reader base. But it was also that I wanted to play with the idea of um a character who's like constantly gaining power as the story progresses, but I wanted to do it in like my own unique way.
Of course.
So it was something that I was interested in, but I wasn't necessarily interested in all the other tropes that
Hmm.
progression fantasy has.
That's interesting. Yeah, but can I ask, like, the impression that I have, and maybe this is true or not, tell me, but that Gunmetal Gods has gone on and seen more success than Lightblade has so far. And granted, Lightblade only have one book, so it's not an unfair comparison, but Gun,
Yeah, that's definitely true. Gunmetal Gods is still, like my main series. It's still the series that I'm writing. I'm having difficulty juggling like both series at the same time. So that's
mm,
probably another thing, to your previous question, something that I
hmm
wish I hadn't done, because one series is enough. And when you have two on your plate and you have readers asking you, where
When's
is
the next?
Lightblade
Yeah,
2? Yeah,
yeah,
where is Gunmetal Gods 4? Where is Lightblade 2? It's difficult to write one book, let alone two.
all right.
So, yeah, I've made a decision to focus on Gunmetal Gods, to finish Gunmetal Gods, to make it the best series that it can be before I shift focus and write more Lightblade books.
Makes sense to me. Makes sense. Yeah, I can imagine trying to juggle the two. The only exception where I think that worked well that I've seen at least recently is Will White, who does write progression fantasy and he does very successful. He has his Cradle series, but before he finished the last, like before he released the last book in the Cradle series, he started his new series. I think that was kind of a clever way to bring
Yeah,
some of the readers along. But
that
yeah,
that's very true. Yeah, some authors can do it, man. Some authors
yeah,
are killing it, man. They have juggling multiple series. Rob Hayes is a good example. This guy juggles
God,
like 4 series at a time. But for me, it's like my brain tries to hyper focus on one thing.
yeah,
So when I wake up, I want to be thinking Gunmetal Gods. When I'm like eating lunch, I want to be thinking Gunmetal Gods. I don't want to be thinking about my taxes. I don't want to be thinking about like, my car, I have to get it fixed. I just want to
yeah,
be thinking Gunmetal Gods, right?
yep.
That's how I kind of get the harmony to write and to imagine these stories.
Yep. Yep. I hear you. I agree. Rob is a machine, but I'm not there. Yeah, right. So tell me, what is your your process like these days? You've written a couple books, you've put them out, so you've probably refined your process, I imagine. Although I've heard from some authors where they sort of approach every book differently. Are you doing that, or have you figured out a system you're like, this is what works for me and I'm sticking to it, you know?
For the first 3 books that I wrote, I did have a system that I used for those books. But for the current book I'm writing, the fourth Gunmetal Gods book, I have changed my system. I have changed my process.
Okay.
So first of all, I switched from Microsoft Word to Scrivener. So
No?
doing that alone was like a big change.
Yeah.
And I'm very happy now using Scrivener. For those who don't know,
Plug.
it's like a app that is just for writing novels. It's not
Yep.
for like, I don't know, drafting,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
resumes and
Yeah.
everything else you can do in Word, right?
So Scrivener,
And
if you're not sponsoring, you should be. Yep.
yeah, I mean I paid like $90 for it, but
Yeah.
it
But
it's
it's
it
great.
it it was worth it. It's good.
Hmm.
Um, and then I sort of changed my so with the first 4 books that I wrote, the 3 Gunmetal God books and Lightblade, I had a process where within 1 or 2 months I would mash out the first draft and just go ham like mashing it out. And
Hmm.
I wouldn't reread whatever I wrote. It was just the forward momentum of just punching through the first draft. But then I found out I had this super long and tedious editing process that I would have to undertake, because I had been so I had been so focused on just mashing that first draft out that I hadn't like really gone, done any editing. So
Hmm.
now what I've done with this fourth Gunmetal Gods book is I've written stuff and then I've edited it after I wrote it. So I'd write a chapter and then I'd edit the chapter. Then I'd write the next chapter, then I'd edit that chapter. And so it's been slower
Interesting.
in terms of getting the first draft and getting the whole story on the page. But now I'm sort of relieved that I don't have this crazy long, tedious editing process that I have to do. So this change in process has just helped me like be more balanced and sort of help me mentally cope with the process. And it's maybe later my process will change again. So it's sort of like things do evolve and things do change.
Yeah, yeah, of course, right. And I feel like it seems to me that as authors progress through their career, they do try to write a cleaner initial draft,
Yep.
because it just makes life easier. But
It
I think
makes life
also
so much easier.
as you're kind of gaining the more experience, you're more able to do that, right? Like, because when you're very first starting, the goal is get it done at all, you know? So that makes sense. Talk to me, what does this look like specifically? Like you finish a chapter, how long does that take? How many words are in your chapter in general? And then how long are you spending kind of going back and editing? And are you doing like really in-depth line editing at that point? Or are you focusing more on the developmental edits? And how are you, do you have an outline or are you a complete pantser? Or, talk me through just a little bit more.
Yeah, in terms of the pantsing versus plotting debate, I am more on the side of pantsing,
Mm-hmm.
but like, I always know, for example, what my ending is, and I always know what the big story beats are, because I have to have something that I'm writing toward. I
Right.
have to have like, okay, like there's this light at the end of the tunnel, right? Now
Yeah.
I don't know what is like between me and that light, but I'm going toward that light. So
Yeah.
my writing always has this momentum that it's going towards something. That is very important for me. But I don't make a detailed outline and say, okay, this has to happen. This is exactly how things are going to go down. This is exactly because when I sit down to write and when I put like the narrative on the page, I always realize that my outlines are so contrived. Like my outlines are like these. They don't make sense in terms of human nature. Like why
Mm,
would the character do this thing that I want him to do? It doesn't
mm-hmm.
make sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like I have to let the characters dictate on the page what they're gonna do.
Mm-hmm.
And so that has always worked for me, and that has not changed. In terms of these, I'm now on my fifth book. That has not changed in that regard. Um,
And how
yeah,
about
and you
in
asked
regard
me,
to the word count of your chapter and like the amount of time that you're spending on kind of the initial draft of that chapter versus the editing that you're doing immediately after.
yeah, my chapters are like generally between 3,000 words and 6,000 words. So they all sort of fall somewhere in there. And I can generally write that much in one day, maybe 2 days.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll spend like the next day looking over it, and I'll do every kind of editing that I can do. I'll do line editing, I'll do developmental editing. I'll kind of I fixate very strongly like on word choice and minutia and all these things, all these technical aspects. So I'll do everything that I can do to make it like as good as it can be, but I won't spend more than like a day doing that on a particular chapter because I don't want to kill my forward momentum completely. So that's the
Mm-hmm.
thing, I still got to have this forward momentum where I'm getting the next chapter out, by the next, maybe after one day or 2 days. So that's been really important still.
That makes a lot of sense. I like that. Yeah, give yourself a day to kind of clean it up and then that's it. Move on after.
Yep.
That's smart. That's taking a note here, taking a note. Yeah, I like that a lot. Okay, and I like what you were saying too about the light at the end of the tunnel. I've heard some people describe that sort of thing as more like a road trip too. I love that analogy also, where like you kind of know where you're going, but you don't necessarily know every little detour that you're going to take along the way. There might be something that you want to see, you know? Yeah. So
That's a
I
great
think,
analogy too. Yeah.
right, right. Um, okay. So what part of the process are you enjoying the most these days? And then what part of the process are you finding the most challenging in terms of the writing, not the business part. Let's leave out that boring stuff out. But in terms of the writing, what's most fun and what's most enjoyable and what's the stuff that's making you pull your hair out? Because I'm sure there's always something.
Yeah. That's a great question. This is like the day-to-day suffering that, us
Yeah,
writers endure.
right.
I'm when I go to sit down to write and I've got this scene imagined in my head. I always love, I love that like forward momentum. I've said this word so many
Hmm.
times, but I
Hmm.
just love like making the scene go forward. But when I do that, I forget like, okay, I need to describe like what this room looks like a little bit. I need to describe like what this character looks like at least a little bit, right? So
Yeah.
then I'm like, okay, I didn't do any of that. I have to go and actually do that, right? And that's the part which is like which can be a struggle sometimes because it's like, oh, I already have a character who's like has blonde hair and green eyes. Why am I what this character has to be different, right? So it's like now I have to think of like some unique way to describe this character, to characterize him. Oh, the other scene was set in a tent. this scene has to be set in a slightly different tent. I have to make things, I have
Yeah,
to make things feel fresh and compelling, and I have to make the reader's experience, enjoyable, which, it's hard work sometimes. It's not all pleasure and fun. Sometimes you really have to get in the weeds and you have to, you know, strain your brain a little bit to come up with things that are satisfying.
right, right. And like, so those are kind of the struggles. What's the part that feels the best? Is it? Well, I guess it's when you're making that forward progress, right?
Yeah, it's like you're unfolding the story. You're
Mm.
getting to the exciting parts where there's like a lot of conflict, where there's like, a lot of my conflict occurs in dialogue. So it's like I'm writing these dialogue exchanges, and I'm not even right. Sometimes I'm not even writing any dialogue tags. I'm just getting the dialogue done. So I'm just writing these two characters having this super heated, very charged, confrontation about basically the topic of the whole book, what the whole
Hmm.
book centers around. And it's super satisfying. It's like, okay, character A has a very good argument. He has a very compelling reason for what he's doing, but so does character B. Here they are going at it, and it's super satisfying for me to put that on the page. But then all I've got here are dialogue. This is not a movie
Yeah.
script. I've got to go in and put in all the other stuff, right?
That's so funny because like I do the same stuff. I do so much. Yeah, yeah. And then it's like, oh wait. That's like, yeah, when I go through editing, I'm like, okay, I need to focus on adding body beats to my dialogue. I need to focus on adding settings. I need to also think about adding like interesting metaphors and similes because that's what we love as readers, you know? Like I have a checklist. It sounds like you have sort of
Exactly.
similar thing. Yeah, yeah. Um, okay, very cool. A lot of your work is also in first person. So to our Right Hive viewers, do you have any particular tips for writing in first person?
Yeah, first person is definitely, I think, in my opinion, more challenging because there's a lot of pitfalls you can fall into. So one of the pitfalls I think is just being too narratively focused on their stream of conscious. So there is a genre of fiction called stream of conscious writing, but if you're writing fantasy, generally that's I from my experience, that's not what readers want.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't want to fall into that pitfall where you're just describing every thought that comes into the character's mind. The way you have to approach first person, ironically, is similar to how you have to approach third person. You have to consciously decide what you want to describe, what is important to the story that you want to put on the page, right? And not necessarily everything the main character is thinking of. Because, like, okay, like I'll randomly think of an elephant, while I'm talking to you, right? And but it's not germane, it's not at all it's not gonna give the reader any satisfaction to see these random tangents. So it's important actually to approach first person like you do third person. And in fact, sometimes, you can just replace every first person adjective with a third person adjective or vice versa, and the narrative would be exactly the same. Now, that's not to say that first person doesn't have some really great advantages, because if it didn't have these advantages, I wouldn't write in first person. For me, it just feels like a more natural narrative voice. It can be more intimate in the sense that you're hearing the story from the person who is in the action. And when you come, especially when it comes to describing thoughts, you can get really, with your language, you can get really personal and really intimate and really close with the language you use to describe feelings and emotions and thoughts. So that's the blessing that I, see in choosing first person.
Nice, nice. Okay. So a little bit of a different question here, of course, related. Gunmetal Gods, as we talked before, you're kind of weaving in this sort of Middle Eastern settings and mythology and that sort of thing in a very interesting way. And I think you really, captured lightning in a bottle in that you got some newness with also some familiarity. And it sounds like you did a lot of work to get there. So kudos to you, because you understood like what the audience was familiar with, and you try to make sure that your language builds on that in ways that they're going to find captivating, but also, bringing them along to this other culture. Well done. Um, but I think that we're seeing more of that in fantasy. I think there's a little bit more push for diversity, which is fantastic. I think more diverse, voices and settings is always a good thing. you know, diversity is what makes people wonderful. If we were all the same, it would be super boring, you know? Um, so, you know, is that something you're seeing too? Are you sort of happy to see that? Do you think it's, or is it like not even close to enough? What is your perspective on sort of the diversity? And even like, feel free to plug the Kickstarter that you're part of now, of that Arabian Nightmares
Yeah.
Kickstarter, which is super cool to see that sort of, that's exactly the sort of thing that I'm talking about. It's neat to see that that's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. This is such an exciting time. Like if you're a reader, we're I mean, we're writers, we love reading too, right? So if you're a
Hmm.
reader, I can read like an amazing book inspired by that creates like a fictional fantasy version of Japan, for example, Sword of Kagan, obviously. Or I could choose any other culture. Like we could choose an African culture, Rage of the Dragons, or if you want to go with a Middle Eastern culture, obviously Gunmetal Gods, and there are others as well. So it's super exciting that this is a thing, because this
Hmm.
was not a thing
Hmm.
even 10 years ago. I mean, I think Saladin Ahmed, Throne of the Crescent Moon, that was the first one that I read that I was like, wow, this is like super amazing. This is a fully realized fantasy world. But instead of transporting me into like medieval England, I've just been transported into medieval Baghdad, and it's just fresh. Whoever you are, wherever you come from, it's like if every book was like a medieval Middle Eastern like story, it wouldn't be fresh. It wouldn't feel
Right.
as fun as it does, right? So this is sort of so I can imagine like 30 years from now people rolling their eyes, oh, another Middle Eastern medieval novel, wow.
Right.
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 But now we're in the time, we're in the prime time when it's fresh and it's fun and it's interesting. And every time you see one of these stories, it's like I read man, what's that? I forget the name, but it was like one of the recent ones that was also based on like the medieval Middle East. And it was super amazing. And it was so cool to see how another person approached what I had, spent a lot of time doing. Like how she approached it, and how she decided to render, this world, to make it palatable for English speaking audiences. It was super interesting, and like and I mean, it's just a great time that we're living in, as readers of fantasy, that we get to transport ourselves to such a diverse array of worlds.
Love that. Totally agree.
Oh, and
Good.
Arabian Nights, or sorry, Arabian Nightmares.
Yeah, yes,
This is,
yes.
yeah, the first Arab horror anthology ever. Uh, isn't Doesn't that sound freaking amazing? It's on Kickstarter right now. We funded it. We're right now we're at 11,000 and change. So we're funding. This is happening. So you can go and back it. 10 authors from the Arab world who are writing different horror stories. Some are contemporary. Mine is like an Arabian Nights style tale, cosmic horror. So yeah, go and back this. It's super cool.
And
So
yeah, the
check that out.
Kickstarter has closed up, but you can still back it on BackerKit. You guys got to go check it out. So, um, I love that, and I totally agree with you. Yeah, like maybe in 30 years it'll be passé or whatever to be like, oh, this Middle Eastern fantasy. It's sort of the way it kind of is with like European medieval fantasy, but it does feel very fresh right now, which is cool. If there's writers out there that are thinking, oh, I want to kind of draw on other kind of world history or world mythology that isn't sort of the standard Western stuff, do you have any kind of tips on how to do it? I mean, clearly one of the things that you've done successful is to consider the audience and to try to make it approachable for them. Is there any kind of things that help with that, or other tips related to getting this out there for the audience that you think is helpful?
Yeah, so I am also a huge history buff. So I read history for fun, and the thing is, there's a verisimilitude between these medieval fantasy stories that we love and history.
Hmm.
Obviously, history is what inspired, Tolkien and George R. R. Martin and all these guys to write what they wrote. So reading history always helps. And if there's a time period that you're particularly interested, like a location or a time period, read history books about that. Read how to, and don't just read like, oh, this king did this and then this king did that. read how were people living? Like, how did people, this is what I had to study, how did people in medieval Damascus, and I read a whole book about this. How did they go about their lives? What did they do from when they woke up to when they went to sleep? And it's very different from what people in medieval England or medieval France did. There are similarities, but there are also major differences. And when you do this, even though the readers don't know this history, readers can still sense the satisfying there's sort of a satisfaction that you get when you sense that, okay, there's a authenticity to what I'm reading, and this this what I'm reading feels real. And that's what I felt when I read Game of Thrones, when I read A Song of Ice and Fire. You just feel like, okay, this feels real. This feels like it's like it could happen in our world, except for the dragons and whatnot. So history always helps with that. History always kind of tells you, it tells you like you know um things about human nature that I think
Yeah.
sometimes when fantasy gets too derivative of other fantasy, sometimes some of that historicity and that authenticity gets lost, and it can make for some people it's fine, but for some readers, when you lose that, it the story can be less compelling,
Hmm.
versus stories that have that sort of authenticity in them.
Yeah. No. Yeah, I totally agree with you. That I remember watching the Game of Thrones show and being like, this feels like, this could be real. And then at the end of the season one, they have the Daenerys with the dragon eggs. Spoiler, but so yeah, Daenerys with the dragon eggs. I was like, we're getting dragons. I was so excited. But like it was because it felt in this like really realized world. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, also totally agree with you. History is awesome. If you don't like history, you just haven't had good teachers. Like, there's so many cool stories in history and great places to draw on it. That's really nice to hear too, that you kind of had to do your own research, even though you sort of, grew up in the Middle Eastern culture. Doing your own research was so instrumental in, making it feel authentic, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Okay. All right. This has been fun. I got one last fun question for you. You've had some different editions of Gunmetal Gods come out, including a Kickstarter that you ran last year with Merrick Books, which looks super cool. You've had different art that's commissioned and different, like I said, editions. What's been I'm gonna go a little broader. Is there like not it could be like a favorite piece of art or favorite opportunity that's come about from being a author now for years that if you hadn't ever first pressed that publish button, you wouldn't have that opportunity. Tell us either about that opportunity or favorite piece of art that you've had, please.
Yeah, I mean, the Kickstarter definitely is like it's the most satisfying thing that I did, and also that I had happened to me since I pressed publish. Because I spent months like putting together all this art, having all this art commissioned, and trying to think of like the most beautiful book that I could, that also embodied, like the themes of gunmetal gods and the setting, the Middle Eastern setting. And um, and then just to see that people responded the way they did, that we were able to raise over $100,000. That was the most satisfying moment in my career thus far. Um, and I think the art, in that book, and I gotta say that in particular, the Arabic calligraphy cover,
Mhm.
that is like, it's like the creature on the original Gunmetal Gods cover, but in Arabic calligraphy. I think that is just, to me, my favorite thing, because there's actually nothing like it in the whole world. And I mean that quite literally. I had to hire a professional Arabic calligrapher, and these guys don't come cheap, like a professional in a field which is already like a niche field, that you're not gonna find these guys like, in your hometown or
Yeah.
anywhere in the world. You're only gonna find them in like specific places where people still practice this art style. Like he happened to be living in Turkey, and he went to like a specific school which taught Arabic calligraphy. And he'd been hired, he was hired by Ubisoft to do Arabic calligraphy for Assassin's Creed. So he's sort of a big name in this field. But the thing with what he did for Gunmetal Gods is that there doesn't exist in the world a piece of Arabic calligraphy of an eldritch Lovecraftian creature. It doesn't exist. So this is
Right.
the only piece of Arabic calligraphy in the world of such a creature, and it's you can only find it in my book, in my Gunmetal God special edition. So having that unique honor is just crazy. It's just amazing. And actually, he's done now the second book, Conqueror's Blood. So he finished his piece for that book. So now there's two in the world. And that's something I haven't revealed yet, but it's amazing. It's better, I'd say, than even the first one. So
Ooh.
yeah, it's super exciting to have this creative opportunity where, not only can I do things on the page with words, but visually I can also do these things where I can take my Middle Eastern Lovecraftian world and I can make it a visual thing,
Right.
which is, I think, since I pressed publish, it's the most, it's the coolest thing I'd say that I've gotten to do.
Love that. That's super cool. That's super cool. Well, I'm excited to see that for the second one. Then, I mean, I've checked out the Kickstarter for the first one. It looks really hot, so I was like, clearly gonna be a second one coming. Very exciting. All right. Well, Zamil, this has been fantastic. Thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it. Where can folks find and follow you online, please?
Yeah, so I am on Twitter, I am on Instagram, I'm on Facebook. You can find me at all of these places at Zamakhtar, or you can also just go to my website, zamilakhtar.com. You'll see all my social media links at the top on there. Yeah, I had a great time, Nicholas. It was a blast. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks to WriteHive, for this opportunity to talk to everyone.
Absolutely. No, the honor is mine. I get to speak with the guest of honor. It's been a pleasure being here. And thank everyone at Right Hive. Appreciate everything you do. Thanks for watching and have a good one. Enjoy the rest of the conference.